It's Friday, the 26th September 2025. A quick look at some of the headlines making waves in Nigeria today. We begin with the Punch newspaper. The leading story says, Coalition demands 𝐒𝐞𝐰𝐬's full membership. The complete story can be found on page 2 of the Punch newspaper. And above that story says, INEC gears up for off-cycle polls, promotes 471 officers. The complete story can be found on page 7 of the Punch newspaper. Niger Delta militancy made Jonathan's presidency possible at 𝐒𝐞𝐰𝐬. The complete story can be found on page 15 of the Punch newspaper. Southeast governors pushing for Nnamdi Kanu's release, says OT. The complete story can be found on page 15 of the Punch newspaper. 804 billion naira arms import ignites calls for local productions. The complete story can be found on page 51 of the Punch newspaper. And below the leading story says, Ladoja ascends Olubadan throne. The complete story can be found on page 19, 20, 21, 32 and 38 of the Punch newspaper. And below that story from the left, Open fire forces Delta Lagos Atlanta flight diversion. The complete story can be found on page 52 of the Punch newspaper. 6 hospitalized as Lagos seals collapse two-story building. The complete story can be found on page 4 and 5 of the Punch newspaper. Marketers fought Dangote's 500,000 litre fuel delivery threshold. The complete story can be found on page 44 of the Punch newspaper. Moving over to Nigerian Tribune. The leading story says, 2027, we will stick to ADC, Mark, Atiku, Amechi, others resolve. The complete story can be found on page 12 of the Nigerian Tribune. And above that story says, Glasgow Investment Summit, Edo government secures $250 million deal. The complete story can be found on page 10 of the Nigerian Tribune. And beside that story says, Tinubu ended career stagnation in paramilitary service, says Tunji Ojo. The complete story can be found on page 35 of the Nigerian Tribune. And below the leading story from the left, nationwide blackout looms as electricity workers get directive for industrial action. The complete story can be found on page 11 of the Nigerian Tribune. Lagos recorded 112 building collapse incidents in 7 years, says BCPG. The complete story can be found on page 11 of the Nigerian Tribune. Arusa 1. Obaladoje's walk to becoming 44 Olubadan. The complete story can be found on page 31, 32 and 33 of the Nigerian Tribune. All set for his coronation today. Makinde cut short his vacation, resumes. Violators of traffic advisory risk vehicle being impounded, says government. The complete story can be found on page 10 of the Nigerian Tribune. Moving over to Vanguard. The leading story says, why apathy dogs voter registration in Southeast, South-South. The complete story can be found on page 5 of the Vanguard. And above that story says, Nigeria attracts $19.92 billion investment signals in quarter 2, 2025. The complete story can be found on page 19 of the Vanguard. And below that story says, Mossop, others reject Tinubu's oil resumption in Ogun. The complete story can be found on page 12 of the Vanguard. Tinubu promotes 52,000 paramilitary officers in 2 years, says Interior Minister. The complete story can be found on page 8 of the Vanguard. DMO offers 200 billion naira FGM bonds for subscription. The complete story can be found on page 19 of the Vanguard. And below the leading story says, traders lament as Lagos government demolishes 19 buildings at Trade Fair Plaza. The complete story can be found on page 7 of the Vanguard. Excitement in Ibadan as Ladoja ascends throne today. The complete story can be found on page 6 of the Vanguard. ADC to members, quit other parties now. The complete story can be found on page 8 of the Vanguard. Black Cat adverted as electricity workers chef strike after federal government intervention. The complete story can be found on page 9 of the Vanguard. In sports, we have 2026 World Cup qualifier. More worries for Chile as Onyedika suffers injury. The complete story can be found on page 37 of the Vanguard. Moving over to Daily Trust. Kwankwaso in talks with Nentawe. The complete story can be found on page 3 and 4 of the Daily Trust. And above that story says, 3 children found dead in father's car in Boronu. The complete story can be found on page 6 of the Daily Trust. Jonathan meets ADC chair David Mark. The complete story can be found on page 6 of the Daily Trust. Olubadan, Tinubu, Atiku, others for Ladoja's coronation today. The complete story can be found on page 25 of the Daily Trust. And below the leading story. Man allegedly killed grandparents in Kano. The complete story can be found on page 5 of the Daily Trust. Security. Castina to procure 5,000 cartons of ammunition. The complete story can be found on page 6 of the Daily Trust. Japan scraps Africa Hometown Initiative. The complete story can be found on page 14 of the Daily Trust. Security operative rescued 9-month-old others in Kwara. The complete story can be found on page 14 of the Daily Trust. Moving over to the last paper on the list today, The Guardian. The leading story says, Economic recovery. Nigeria not broke, but deep fiscal concerns linger. The complete story can be found on page 4 and 5 of The Guardian. And above that story says, 2027, 𝐒𝐞𝐰 bring others vow to retake Kano for Tinubu. The complete story can be found on page 3 of The Guardian. Over 6,000 lives lost to religious, ethnic conflict, says Plateau Governor. The complete story can be found on page 29 of The Guardian. 2027, ADC leaders scramble to fix deep rift as opposition coalition nears collapse. The complete story can be found on page 6 of The Guardian. And below the leading story says, From politics to palace, Ladoja's Odyssey to Olubadan throne. Politics and policy. The complete story can be found on page 22 of The Guardian. New study links poverty. Transport woes to worsen health in Lagos. The complete story can be found on page 27 of The Guardian. How Tinubu ended career stagnation in paramilitary services. The complete story can be found on page 2 of The Guardian. Black Cat averted as electricity workers suspend strike. The complete story can be found on page 3 of The Guardian. And these are the headlines making waves in Nigeria today. If any of these headlines caught your attention, do get a copy of the paper to read the complete story.